Hi there, I'm Coach Susana, and today I'm going to explain the basics of partswork. Partswork is based on internal family systems, or IFS. This is a therapeutic model mostly used by some therapists, but there are some coaches like me that are trained in it as well. The first core concept of partswork is we all have many parts. There's not just one you, there's not just one me. We all have multiple selves, and that's normal. It doesn't mean you have multiple personality disorder, today known as DID. Now, folks with DID are simply at the extreme end of the spectrum of what's normal, in which their parts have split off and are acting independently. These multiple selves are called parts because that's the language that Dick Schwartz, the creator of IFS, heard from his clients. Now, the concepts behind partswork and IFS are actually ancient, universal, and archetypal. They've been around long before Dick Schwartz, and he acknowledges that. But he created the modern modality of IFS through his work as a therapist and as an academic. Without realizing it, you've probably already used the language of parts in your own life, especially when you felt conflicted about something. So for example, a part of me totally wants to go out to dinner with my friends tonight, and another part of me totally wants to stay home, veg on the couch, and watch a movie. Or a part of me is really excited about this new job, a part of me is terrified, and another part of me kind of thinks it might be a little beneath me. The idea here is you literally have different parts of you with different needs, goals, and personalities. The second core concept of partswork is our inner world is a system, and our different parts serve different functions or roles in that internal system that can be very useful but sometimes problematic. I'm going to show you some visuals now to give you a better sense of your internal system, the different kinds of parts you have, and how they interact with each other and with you. If you think about your internal system as a planet, that planet has two continents. The first is the unburdened parts, and the second is the burdened parts. The unburdened parts are at choice, they're in their natural, healthy state, they're not desperate, and they're not extreme. So you can think about these unburdened parts like you might think about your car. When your car is working well and all the different components are functioning the way that they're supposed to, the way they're designed, we don't even really notice them going about their different jobs. We just get in the car and they drive. It's the burden parts that we most notice because they start to cause problems in our lives, and those are the parts that we work with in partswork. Burden parts are not at choice. They've taken on extreme roles, and they carry burdens of pain, distressful emotions, and/or limiting beliefs. And on this continent of burden parts, there are two different nations, the Exiles and the Protectors. The Exiles don't have a job. These are young, vulnerable, sensitive parts. They carry burdens of overwhelming pain, grief, terror, and/or shame. And they hold the key to self-leadership. I'll talk more about what self-leadership means in a little bit, but they hold the key to self-leadership because when these exiles are liberated of their burdens of pain through partswork, that's actually what creates profound and lasting shifts in our system. So our protectors, unlike our exiles, have a job. They have a very, very important job, which is to protect those exiles and/or protect the system from the pain of the exiles. So they are fear-driven and safety-obsessed with good reason. So they are working 24/7, very hard and very loyally to keep us safe. Exiles and protectors are in a very key relationship here. You can't have an exile without a protector, and you can't have a protector without an exile. So they are in a symbiotic, close relationship in how they work together. So our nation of protectors has two subcultures. The first is the managers, and the second is the firefighters. Our managers are Plan A. These are protectors that are proactive and preventative. They plan, do tasks, and strive, and their motto is never again. So they work very hard and organize your life to make sure that you never go through that pain, shame, terror, grief ever again. So before I talk about the firefighters, I want to unpack the protectors and the managers a little bit more for you. So when you hear the term protector, you might think of an image like one of these, just like we have in the outside world. Now, these images, to be fair, are a little culturally narrow, but there are types of protectors that might show up inside. These images and the ones I'll show you next come from Tom Holmes's book, that I'll show you later. But I, for example, have a protector that looks very much like this guy right here. It's kind of an old knight, old Nordic type knight. I have a protector that looks like this guy also. He's kind of a Wild West sheriff, Robert Duvall type character I call the regulator. So whether you relate to these or not, you might connect with the ways that we think of protectors as kind of being these fierce warrior types. That's true. And also, especially when it comes to our managers, it can get a little bit more subtle and a little bit more complex. So first of all, you may have heard the term inner critic. Our inner critics are protectors that are managers. So again, these are a little culturally narrow, but you might be relating to, sort of this moralistic figure inside that wants to tell us what's right and wrong. If you live in the Western civilized, industrialized civilization, or especially in the U.S., we come from puritanical roots. So there's sort of that idea of morality. You might have an internal judge like this gentleman who's sort of legalistic and sort of always calling whether we're right or wrong, or this crusty school marm, or someone who's constantly critiquing your appearance. So these inner critics that you may be familiar with are protectors that are managers. Okay, they're trying to organize our lives to make sure never again do we experience those overwhelming feelings. However, there's another layer of managers which you also might relate to. So a lot of my clients relate to and connect with this lady over here with all the arms doing all the things all the time. We've got these different characters, many of us inside, who are saying things like, do it all, buy more stuff, get a good career, make yourself beautiful, get a good education, work hard. This one in particular connects and resonates with a lot of my clients, sort of this activist, change the world for the better, do-gooder. And this mom, this be a good mom, this sort of symbolic caretaker who's always taking care of other people, whether female or male. Now, you may be wondering, how are these protectors? Aren't these benign? I think this is who I really am. And what partswork invites us to think about is that actually these are protectors that are managers. We're not saying they're bad. We're saying that really what they're doing is trying to keep the exiles exiled and to protect the exiles from going through again what they went through before, and protect our internal system from their overwhelming burdens of pain, shame, terror, grief. Okay. Now, firefighters are Plan B. Unlike the managers, they are reactive. Their job is to distract, soothe, and numb us. And their motto is whatever it takes to keep those exiles exiled and to protect the system from their burdens of pain. And so here is an image that you might also connect to. So your firefighters might show up in getting really into sports or video games. It might be online shopping. It might be substances like eating a lot or drugs of various kinds. It could be gambling. It could be excessive exercise. There's a lot of different ways that these firefighters show up. But what they're doing is distracting, soothing, and numb us, and they play a very important part in our internal system. Before we go on, I want to say a little bit more about managers and firefighters. First of all, you may already have sort of come to this conclusion on your own that manager and firefighter parts are not viewed or treated neutrally or equitably in the external world. So manager behaviors are very often celebrated, encouraged, and rewarded, especially in Western industrialized and US culture. Whereas firefighter parts and firefighter behaviors, not so much. So folks who are struggling with various types of addictions or substances, their behaviors that firefighter parts do are marginalized in our culture. So I think it's important to name that. But both of them are working very hard at very important jobs as protectors to keep our system safe. The second thing I want to say about managers and firefighters is that some people's internal systems are more dominated by one or the other. So if you know me at all, you probably guessed correctly that I'm a manager-dominated system. So my protectors have a lot more managers typically than firefighters. Other people's systems are dominated by firefighters. And those, again, are folks that can struggle a whole lot more because those parts and those behaviors are more marginalized by societies. So some folks' systems are dominated by a polarization between a manager and a firefighter, or a group of managers and a group of firefighters. So, for example, those that really struggle with their weight and they've got managers that are really, intent on regular exercise and very quote unquote disciplined around that and counting calories. Well, there's also these firefighters that really like to binge eat, and they may toggle back and forth, where the managers are working very hard to control the firefighters and the firefighters are pushing back on the managers. You may also find that you may have certain situations where you experience a polarization between managers and firefighters inside. So at this point, you might be wondering where parts come from. And there's a lot of discussion about this in the IFS community amongst folks that do this work even more deeply and research it than I do. But it seems to be that many of our parts we're born with. Some of them come into us through our lineage or through our culture. And many appear at the moment of trauma, especially when we're children. Because when we're kids, our brain and our nervous system aren't fully developed yet. So we literally, biologically and biochemically and physiologically don't yet have the capacity to fully process or make sense of the overwhelming emotions and experiences that we might go through. So these exiles are created at those moments. This happens as adults as well, but particularly in childhood, it can be created at those moments to sort of take on those burdens of the overwhelming experience and emotion and put them aside. Exiles can also be an expression of unwanted parts of ourselves when we were younger that got put aside. So it might be a personality trait like being very loud and big, or maybe being quote unquote too quiet. Or it might be identity, such as being queer, LGBTQ, or a person of color or racially different than your family community or sort of those around you. The third core concept of parts work is all parts are good. And if you missed it, those words just showed up at the bottom of our planet. All parts are good. Even the parts that motivate us to lie, cheat, harm ourselves, or even murder other people aren't bad. There are bad roles for parts, but the parts themselves aren't bad. They're just trying to protect us. Now, this is a simple yet very profound and important concept to parts work that actually differentiates itself from other modalities that try to suppress parts or make them go away. So those might be more manager-dominated modalities. This is so important that Dick Schwartz actually wrote an entire book called No Bad Parts. And he is convinced that there are no bad parts, even though he's done a lot of his work with violent offenders and sex offenders. So the third core concept here is that there are bad roles for parts, but no bad parts themselves. The fourth core concept of parts work is self is who we really are. Self with a capital S. My teacher, Guthrie Sion, says, our true nature is awake, aware, wise, loving, and good. Self is fully developed. It's whole and undamaged. It's our enlightened core, and it's always present, just like the sun is there, even when there's clouds in the way. And self is our true nature. Now, as you're hearing this, you may be connecting with the fact that these concepts are common to many cultural and spiritual traditions. So for you, you might think about self as soul, higher self, or inner divine. Those words might connect better for you. Now, it's a lack of self-leadership. So I said I would talk about self-leadership later when I was talking about the exiles. It's a lack of self-leadership that causes parts to organize into exiles and protectors, those two nations on the continent of burdened parts. Now, saying that it's a lack of self-leadership that causes this is not a judgment. It's not shame or blame. It's just that we don't have the internal or external resources, especially when we're young, to process all those overwhelming experiences and emotions. So the parts step in and take on the roles that the adults around us weren't taking or that we were unable to do on our own. So that's our protectors in action. This is the tragedy of the protectors, however, is that they're actually unable to successfully fulfill their jobs without self. So they're working extremely hard and loyally without the main tool required. And one of the reasons for this is that we have trouble really accessing self until our nervous system is fully developed. The signposts of self, or core qualities, are the 8 C's: calm, confident, curious, compassionate, clear, courageous, creative, and connected. When you connect with one or more of these qualities, you're connecting more with self and bringing more self energy into your internal system. And if you do parts work or IFS, you'll notice that your practitioner will work with you to connect you to these qualities and bring more of this self energy through these qualities into your internal system. What's cool is that self energy also exists in all of our parts. And parts work helps us bring that self energy into the system, which allows us to liberate our exiles and transform our protectors. So speaking of liberation and transformation, the 5th core concept of parts work is that we can't get rid of parts. We can only help them take on new roles. And this again is what differentiates parts work and IFS from some other modalities. Now we help them take on these new roles, these new jobs through the parts work process, which this parts work process allows us to bring more self energy and self leadership to our parts and our system, which allows us to take on the role of what our hardworking, loyal protectors have been trying to do but can't. So being liberated of that extreme or dysfunctional role frees them up to take on new jobs. So our liberated protectors can then become champions, allies, resources, and partners in achieving and enjoying our lives more, because our exiles have transformed into sources of joy, inspiration, and spontaneity or play. So an unburdened system has harmonious balance, healthy competition, equitable distribution of resources, and self-leadership. And parts work helps us create more of an unburdened system that has those qualities. To summarize, these are the 6 core concepts of parts work. And these are mine, but I'm building on what I've learned from my teacher, Guthrie Sion. We all have many parts. Having multiple selves is normal. Our inner world is a system. Our parts interact with each other, ourselves, and the external world. All parts are good. There are no bad parts, only bad or extreme roles for parts. Self is who we really are. We are not our parts. Self is that enlightened core that's always present. We cannot get rid of parts, only invite them into new roles. We're not trying to banish or get rid of them. In fact, we can't get rid of them. Only unburden the exiles and transform those protectors. And finally, new concept here, as within, so without. So you've probably already made a lot of connections between what I've been talking about and what we see in our external world. You heard me talk about how our culture celebrates, encourages, and rewards manager behaviors much more than firefighter behaviors, for example. So you also might be thinking of some parallels in how we assign people in our societies to take on roles like who we treat as exiles, who takes on the role of manager, who our firefighters are, and how they can end up in polarizations with each other and dysfunctional dynamics together. So what's beautiful here is that as we bring more self-energy and self-leadership into our own internal system, we're actually bringing that self-leadership into the external world. Most of my training in parts work has come from Guthrie Sion. Here's Guthrie. Guthrie holds a PhD, a PCC coaching credential, and deep training in IFS. Guthrie's been training coaches in parts work since 2013. And I first met him in 2014 when I went through my year-long coach training program called Coaching for Transformation with Leadership That Works. Guthrie's on the faculty there, and part of our training involved some sessions with Guthrie and learning parts work. Fast forward many years later, I went through a year-long intensive from 2021 to 2022 with Guthrie, specifically in training coaches to do parts work with clients, and that involved about 80 hours of training and practice. Aside from Guthrie, I've attended several talks and webinars by Dick Schwartz and other leading folks in the IFS field, and I do my own reading. So as of this recording, some of my favorite books so far have been Dick Schwartz's book, No Bad Parts, which you heard me talk about earlier. Tom Holmes's book, very useful for its visuals. You saw some of the pictures from it earlier in this workshop, and you can refer to it quite a bit. And then as a trauma-informed coach, I also enjoy this book on trauma by Frank Anderson, specifically with an IFS parts work lens. If I have a coaching client that's internally conflicted about something or at war with a part or parts of themselves, then I may ask if they'd like to try a process that allows us to go deeper. If they say yes, then I explain the basics of parts work, not in as much detail as I did here, or I send them the video. If they say yes to trying parts work, then first I set the stage with some clear agreements around safety, privacy, choice, and confidentiality. Now, those are things that we covered in our initial contracting as coach and client, but there are aspects I like to remind, highlight, and build on to set the stage for deeper work. From there, parts work is actually a highly structured process with multiple steps, but in general, they break down to the following. First, we identify the target part or parts that the client wants to work on. Second, we unblend the parts from the client. So I really help the client experience themselves as more than just their parts and help them connect with that self-energy I talked about earlier, one or more of those 8 C's. Third, we befriend the protector and get to know their goals and agenda. Now, as you heard, if there's an exile, there's always a protector, so we go to the protector first and get to know them. We then access the exile with the protector's permission, We witness and unburden the exile, invite new qualities into the exile, and then invite the protector into a new role in the system. We may or may not get through all those steps, but regardless of where we end up in the process, there's a lot of gratitude for the system, lots of thanking of all of the parts, and then some clear next steps for the client that they can take forward and move the work beyond our session. So what's funny is I thought I invented partswork. Many years ago, I became more and more aware of these different parts of me and decided to get curious and playful. So I gave them names, avatars, personalities. I talked to them. I had them talk to each other. There was one time a bunch were in conflict and I actually sent them on a road trip in a VW bus. So here are my OG parts, the original 15. At this point, at the time of this recording, I've probably worked with 30 to 40 of my parts. So I've been doing this on my own for quite a while, and I've done it with my coaching clients as well, which I called internal committee. I learned from one of my therapists at one point that becoming aware of oneself as having parts and interacting with them like this is actually not uncommon for trauma survivors. And I do identify as a trauma survivor. And I've had a couple clients who did this organically on their own as well and kind of were worried that they were a little cuckoo. But again, just want to normalize that we all have parts, and those of us that are trauma survivors might be more aware of them. So I discovered Dick Schwartz and IFS at some point and was like, wow, look, there's these people that have been researching and doing this for decades. I'll just jump on that bandwagon. So it's not just something that I think about abstractly or work with my clients on. It's also something that I live. I interact with and work with my parts almost daily, and I've gotten much better at interacting with them and working with them when I'm stressed or in crisis. I've also gone through IFS therapy, so I've had a therapist that's trained in IFS, so I've received that therapeutic support as well. If you'd like to do parts work with me, I'd love to talk to you. If you're one of my current coaching clients, just bring it up at any time during any session that you'd like to try parts work, or shoot me an email in between. If you're not one of my current coaching clients, I offer a complimentary 30-minute coaching chemistry call where we get on video and explore whether or not we're a good fit for working together, whether or not coaching is right for you right now, and whether or not parts work is right. So if you'd like to do that, just contact me using the information at the bottom of the screen or in the video notes. Until then, here's to more self-leadership in our internal systems and more self-leadership in our world.